In a quiet suburban neighborhood where rules were supposed to protect homeowners, one man discovered just how far an HOA could go when greed takes over. What began as a routine notice slipped under his door quickly turned into a shocking demand, a $50,000 bill for using the very driveway he had owned for decades. The HOA claimed it technically belonged to them, unaware that buried deep inside old archives existed a piece of proof that would destroy their entire plan. This is the story of how one homeowner exposed their lie, flipped the power dynamic, and made the HOA regret ever targeting him. From the outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful, manicured hedges, matching mailboxes, and driveways that sparkled after every rainfall. But beneath that polished surface lived an HOA that thrived on intimidation, surprise rules, and sudden fines that appeared like traps waiting to snap. Homeowners walked carefully, always checking their lawns twice, always reading every email, always fearing the next envelope slipped under their door. Yet even in a place where the HOA loved to flex power, no one expected what they attempted next. And no one was more blindsided than the homeowner at the center of it all. It started on a Tuesday morning, quiet and unremarkable. The birds were loud, the lawn sprinklers were ticking, and the world seemed normal, until he opened his front door. A bright red envelope sat on his welcome mat, stamped with bold letters that always sent a chill through the neighborhood. HOA priority notice. Usually, it meant something small, something annoying, something petty. But this envelope felt heavier, almost intentionally dramatic, as if the board wanted to make a statement before it was even read. Inside was a formal letter printed on thick white paper. The HOA always liked to look expensive and official. But the words on the page carried a weight he'd never felt before. The HOA declared that his driveway, yes, the same driveway he had parked on for decades, the one listed on his home deed, the one poured by the builder long before the HOA even existed, was technically association property. And because he had been using it without authorization, he now owed the association $50,000 in usage fees, due within 30 days. The letter didn't ask politely. It demanded. It accused. It read as if he had trespassed on land that never belonged to him, as if the ground beneath his feet had quietly switched ownership while no one noticed. The HOA didn't frame it as a misunderstanding, they framed it as a crime. For a moment he stood there frozen, gripping the paper so tightly the edges bent in his hands. A driveway? His driveway? The same one he shoveled snow from every winter? The same one he sealed and repaired with his own money? The HOA's argument was beyond bizarre. It was outrageous, absurd, and clearly meant to intimidate. But intimidation only works on people who panic. He wasn't one of them. Still, the letter didn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense in an HOA-controlled neighborhood, it usually means one thing: manipulation. The HOA president had recently changed. The new one, an overly confident, rule-obsessed woman with a habit of trying to reinterpret rules to her advantage, had been on a power trip since the day she took office. She wanted control, and she wanted money. And the fastest way to get both was to invent new reasons to fine people. But a driveway? This was a different level of bold. As the morning passed, he walked the length of the driveway, observing it as if seeing it for the first time. Cracks he memorized, stains he knew by heart, a path he paced thousands of times. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing suggested the HOA had any claim over it. And yet they insisted he had to pay for unauthorized long-term use of his own property. The neighborhood had seen fines for things like mismatched flowers, trash cans placed 3 minutes early, and holiday lights hung too joyfully. But this letter was a declaration of war, disguised as paperwork. By noon, whispers began spreading. The HOA never kept their drama private. They liked residents to see what happened to people who didn't bend. He noticed neighbors glancing his way, murmuring at their mailboxes, checking their phones as if expecting an update. Even the HOA volunteers patrolling the sidewalks walked slower near his house, pretending to check plants while clearly waiting for his reaction. But he didn't panic. Instead, he did one thing the HOA never expected. He started digging. Hidden in a storage box at the back of his attic, buried under old tax documents and newspaper clippings, were the original builder files from when the house was constructed, files untouched for 30 years. Dusty, faded, but intact. These papers were the kind people forgot existed. The kind of papers that could save someone years later. The kind HOAs rarely bothered to check before creating rules. He sifted through the pile with slow precision. Property surveys, architectural layouts, boundary documents, old letters from the city. And then he found it, a signed document from the original land developer, clearly stating that the driveway, sidewalk edge, and the first 8 feet of the property were privately owned by the homeowner, not community land. The HOA was not only wrong, they were attempting to confiscate private property. It was the kind of mistake, or manipulation, that could collapse an HOA if exposed. And the best part? This document was dated long before the HOA even existed. With the proof in hand, the panic the HOA expected never arrived. Instead, he felt a simmering determination. If the HOA wanted a fight, they weren't getting a scared homeowner, they were getting someone with evidence, patience, and 3 decades of receipts. But the HOA didn't know that yet, and they were already preparing their next move. By evening, another envelope arrived, this one claiming refusal to comply and escalating the threat. They believed they held all the power. They believed the homeowner would break before they did. They believed no one kept records older than the HOA itself. What they didn't believe, because their arrogance blinded them, was that their entire plan would collapse under one old document. And as night settled over the neighborhood, the homeowner realized something important. This wasn't just about a driveway. This was about exposing a board that had gone unchecked for far too long. This was about showing every frightened neighbor that the HOA wasn't invincible. He didn't know it yet, but the next days would bring inspectors, lawyers, meetings, shouting matches, and a scandal that would make the entire community question everything they thought they knew. The HOA had made a fatal mistake. The next morning didn't bring calm, it brought escalation. The HOA moved fast, far faster than any reasonable organization should. Before sunrise, 2 board members were already pacing the sidewalk outside his home, clipboards in hand, whispering like vultures waiting for something to die. Their posture was confident, almost smug, as if they believed their manufactured authority was enough to intimidate anyone who dared resist. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were performing, making sure the entire community saw who controlled the neighborhood. By 7 o'clock, a brand new HOA violation sign had been staked into his front yard. Bright red, obnoxiously large, intentionally humiliating. It declared his property under investigation for unauthorized use of association land. Neighbors walking their dogs paused, reading it with confusion and disbelief. Some shook their heads. Others pretended not to care. A few, the kind who always supported HOA drama, watched with unsettling excitement. But one thing was clear, the board wanted this spectacle. They wanted the whispers. They wanted fear. What they didn't want was someone who wasn't afraid. He walked outside calmly, picked up the sign, and set it aside like it was nothing more than trash left on his lawn. The board members on the sidewalk stiffened instantly. Their performance was ruined. They were expecting shouting, panic, or desperate bargaining, something dramatic they could use against him. Instead, they were faced with a homeowner who looked unbothered, even composed. For the HOA, that was the worst possible response. By mid-morning, the HOA president herself had arrived. The woman carried herself like a judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one. She wore a blazer that looked too expensive for an HOA salary and walked with the confidence of someone who believed the entire neighborhood owed her obedience. She marched directly to his driveway, inspecting the concrete as if expecting to find a secret symbol that would prove her claim. Then she stood in the center with her hands on her hips, staring at the house as if challenging him to come out. She wanted a confrontation. She wanted a scene. She wanted to establish dominance. What she got was silence. Instead of rushing to meet her rage, he spent the morning organizing the documents he found in the attic. 3 decades of papers carefully spread across his dining table, surveys, permits, maps, and that key developer's document. The one piece of evidence that proved the driveway was legally and permanently his. He placed it into a protective sleeve like a weapon ready for battle. Meanwhile, the HOA president, increasingly irritated, walked back and forth across the driveway measuring distances, marking spots with chalk, and scribbling wildly in her binder. She acted as though finding even the smallest inconsistency would justify the $50,000 demand. She even called in 2 HOA volunteers to verify boundaries, both of whom looked more confused than confident. To any observer, it was obvious. They were scrambling. Their bold claim about the driveway being association property was shaky at best, invented at worst. And the more time passed, the more desperate their attempts became. Around noon, the HOA escalated again. A formal summons was taped to his front door, an emergency meeting with the board scheduled in exactly 48 hours. The letter was written like a legal threat, overflowing with phrases like final decision, mandatory attendance, and severe penalties. It demanded he bring a payment plan for the $50,000 fee. They weren't asking if he agreed, they assumed he had no choice. But what they didn't know was that he was already preparing something far more dangerous than a payment plan. He was preparing the truth. While the HOA plotted their next move, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors. Some neighbors were sympathetic, others were nervous, and a few, the HOA loyalists, spread the ridiculous claim that he had stolen land from the association and refused to pay his dues. It was incredible how quickly misinformation moved when fueled by fear and gossip. But even as the neighborhood churned with speculation, he stayed focused. He scanned every inch of the original documents, double-checking boundary lines, dates, signatures, and legal references. Everything matched perfectly. Everything supported his side. The HOA had no legal ground, not even a pebble of it. Their entire accusation was built on one thing, their belief that no one would dare challenge them. They were wrong. Just before sunset, another surprise arrived. This time, it was an HOA-purchased private surveyor who pulled up in a truck, stepping out with tools and measuring instruments. The HOA president greeted him with hurried enthusiasm, pointing at the driveway as if she had already won. The surveyor, however, didn't share her excitement. He worked slowly, professionally, scanning the property lines with the precision of someone who had no interest in HOA politics. He completed his measurements in under 20 minutes. Then he walked over to the HOA president and quietly handed her a slip of paper. Whatever result he found didn't need an audience. But her expression said everything. Her confidence cracked. Her shoulders stiffened. Her eyes darted toward the house, full of frustration and disbelief. The survey didn't support her claim. The driveway wasn't HOA property. It had never been HOA property. Humiliated but refusing to accept reality, she dismissed the surveyor with forced politeness, then stormed off with her binder clutched tightly to her chest. The remaining board members looked uneasy, exchanging uncertain glances. The performance that began strong was unraveling, thread by thread. But the collapse wasn't over, not yet. That night, the homeowner organized his evidence into a file labeled Driveway Ownership, Legal Proof. Every document neatly arranged and backed by the developer's signature. Attached to it was a copy of the HOA's illegal demand letter, something that could get them in serious trouble if exposed. He wasn't just preparing to defend himself. He was preparing to bring down people who abused power. And while he worked, something unexpected happened. A knock on his door. 2 neighbors stood outside, hesitant but sincere. They whispered what others were too scared to say aloud. The HOA had done things like this before. Smaller things. Hidden things. Petty fines. Quiet threats. They admitted they were afraid to confront the board, afraid of retaliation, afraid of losing the little piece the neighborhood had left. But seeing what the HOA was doing to him lit a spark no one expected. Finally, someone was standing up. Finally, someone wasn't backing down. And people were watching. One thing became clear. The HOA thought they were tightening a noose around his neck. But with each move they made, they were tightening it around their own. The night before the meeting felt unusually tense. The neighborhood, normally quiet after sunset, seemed alive with whispers and speculation. Porch lights stayed on longer, curtains shifted, and silhouettes paused near windows whenever he stepped outside. Everyone knew what was coming. An emergency HOA meeting wasn't normal. It meant drama, power struggles, and public humiliation. And this one was different. This one involved a $50,000 accusation that made even the most loyal HOA supporters uncomfortable. The homeowner didn't spend the evening worrying. Instead, he prepared meticulously. The binder containing his documents sat on the dining table like a shield waiting for battle. Every paper was in order: the original developer contract, the 30-year-old survey, city letters confirming property boundaries, and copies of every threatening letter the HOA had sent. It was more than enough evidence, not just to defend himself, but to expose what the HOA had been doing behind closed doors. The next morning arrived with cold air and heavy clouds, as if the weather itself anticipated conflict. By noon, homeowners began walking toward the community center, clutching water bottles and folding chairs. Even those who usually avoided HOA business showed up, curious to witness the showdown. They had seen too many strange notices, too many sudden fines, too many petty rules. This meeting wasn't just about a driveway. It reflected something simmering beneath the surface for years. When the homeowner arrived, the room fell quiet. The HOA board sat at the front behind a long table, papers stacked in intimidating piles. The president sat in the center, posture rigid, lips tight, eyes narrow. She had the expression of someone trying desperately to maintain control. On her right, 2 board members avoided eye contact. On her left, a loyal volunteer tapped nervously on a laptop, preparing what looked like a slideshow. This wasn't a meeting. This was a staged attack. The HOA president began the meeting with false confidence, tapping the microphone as if she were the host of a grand event. She welcomed everyone in a tone dripping with authority, then immediately launched into a speech accusing the homeowner of encroaching on association land and refusing to resolve the matter responsibly. She spoke as though her claim was undeniable fact, as though their earlier survey results had never happened. Her voice echoed across the room, but the reaction was not what she expected. Instead of nods, she received murmurs of doubt. Instead of supportive glances, she saw raised eyebrows and skeptical looks. Homeowners weren't as easily manipulated as she thought. When she finished her speech, she sat back with an air of triumph, as if expecting applause. Instead, silence filled the room. A thick, uncomfortable silence that stretched longer and longer until she finally gestured sharply at the homeowner to speak. He stood calmly, carrying only one item, his binder. No fear. No hesitation. No weakness. He began by placing the binder on the table in front of the board. The sound it made, heavy, confident, undeniable, shifted the entire atmosphere. The president's expression faltered for the first time. He opened the binder, revealing the original property documents. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't accuse. He simply narrated the facts. The driveway was built before the HOA existed. The property lines were surveyed and approved by the city. The developer transferred the land directly to the first owner. That ownership passed legally from one homeowner to the next. There had never been any association claim on the driveway. The room absorbed every word. And with each piece of evidence he placed on the table, the HOA president's confidence deteriorated further, her posture slouching, fingers tightening, eyes darting from paper to audience. But the turning point came when he produced the document signed by the original developer, the one that proved the driveway was private property, permanently, without any loophole. Gasps rippled across the room. Chairs shifted. People whispered in disbelief. The HOA president tried to interrupt, tried to dismiss the document as old or irrelevant, but the homeowners were no longer listening to her. They were reading the papers passed down the rows, examining signatures, dates, maps, official stamps. For the first time, the community wasn't taking the board's word as truth, they were seeing the truth themselves. And the truth wasn't on the HOA's side. But the most devastating moment was yet to come. The homeowner revealed something the HOA never expected: copies of every threatening letter the board had sent, each one stronger than the last, full of intimidation and fabricated claims. The audience murmurs turned into sharp whispers, then into audible frustration. A few residents shook their heads openly. One man in the back muttered, "They've done this before." The HOA president's face reddened. Her power was slipping through her fingers in real time. And then came the final blow. The homeowner calmly mentioned the private survey the HOA had ordered. Yes, the same survey they had tried to hide because it contradicted their accusations. The crowd reacted instantly. Heads turned. People demanded answers. And the HOA president, cornered and visibly shaken, struggled to lie her way out of it. But lies weren't enough anymore. The neighborhood wanted honesty. They wanted accountability. They wanted answers. The tension snapped when a homeowner from the back stood and addressed the entire room. They revealed they had also received questionable notices, unexplained fines, and disturbing letters. Others chimed in. One by one, residents began sharing their own experiences, things they had been too afraid to voice before. The meeting no longer belonged to the HOA. It belonged to the community. By the time the uproar settled, the board was visibly fractured. One member quietly packed his belongings and walked out. Another sat motionless, staring at the table. The president, once so proud, now looked like she was struggling to hold back a full collapse. When the homeowner finally sat down, the room erupted into applause, a sound that shook the walls and echoed through the building. It wasn't just for him. It was for every resident who had suffered silently under the HOA's abuse. The power shift had begun. And the HOA knew it. If you're enjoying this HOA chaos story, don't forget to like, comment your HOA experience, and subscribe for more insane real-life neighborhood drama stories. The following week moved slowly, thick with tension, as if the entire neighborhood understood that a storm was building. The HOA board members behaved differently now, less arrogant, more calculated, yet still annoyingly confident in their supposed authority. They continued sending letters, each one stamped with warnings that sounded more theatrical than legal. They insisted the homeowner resolve the matter immediately, claiming that delays might jeopardize community uniformity, a phrase that felt more like a threat than a guideline. But beneath their polished professionalism was an unmistakable nervousness, because they sensed something was slipping beyond their control. The homeowner spent those days preparing quietly. He wasn't loud or reactive like they expected. Instead, he dug deeper into public records, gathered property maps, tax receipts, and every document connected to the driveway. What he discovered wasn't just proof, it was an entire paper trail showing how every previous HOA president had confirmed the driveway was private property. Their signatures, stamps, and meeting notes stacked up like a growing mountain of undeniable evidence. One wrong claim was a mistake. 30 years of paperwork proving them wrong was humiliation. The HOA kept underestimating him, especially the new president, who had built her identity on intimidation. She walked the neighborhood like a queen inspecting her land, correcting people's mailbox colors and glare-checking lawn heights. Her confidence came from years of never being challenged. This time, though, she was stepping onto ground that belonged to someone else, literally. And the man she tried to bully was done being silent. By midweek, he visited the county archives again, hoping to find even more material. As he sifted through yellowed papers and dusty folders, he came across something unexpected, a signed maintenance agreement from the early 2000s where the HOA asked permission to use his driveway during neighborhood repairs. Not only did they acknowledge it wasn't theirs, they documented it. He sat with the paper in his hands, stunned for a moment, realizing that this wasn't a small victory. It was a bombshell. Meanwhile, the HOA was preparing its own move. They planned to escalate the complaint to a formal violation hearing. Their confidence came from the assumption he had nothing but his word. They didn't know he had assembled a binder thicker than their entire rulebook. They didn't know his neighbor was willing to testify. And they absolutely didn't know he discovered their archived maintenance request, a document that made the entire case collapse instantly. On the morning of the hearing, he carried the binder into the community hall. The room was arranged like a cheap courtroom imitation, board members seated in a stiff row, clipboards in hand, wearing matching expressions of superiority. They weren't ready for what he placed on the table. As the binder opened, page after page of scanned maps, dated signatures, official county seals, and written acknowledgments appeared like a professional presentation built to destroy arrogance. The board members froze. Their confidence evaporated into something smaller, almost fragile. The president's face stiffened, her jaw tightening as she tried to appear unaffected, but her eyes flickered with panic each time he flipped a page. By the time he finished, the room felt cold and tense. The board whispered among themselves, trying to find a way to reposition their claim, but there was nothing left to stand on. Their only option was denial, but denial looked ridiculous when 30 years of proof sat in front of them. They realized this wasn't someone they could bully, silence, or financially drain. This was someone who had just exposed their incompetence, maybe even corruption, if the documents became public. And as the hearing ended, something even more dramatic was about to unfold, something that would shift the power in the neighborhood permanently. But what happened next would push the HOA into full desperation mode, and force them to make a mistake they could never undo. The hours after the hearing unfolded in a strange, simmering silence across the neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the thick, uneasy quiet that follows after someone has been publicly exposed, the kind that settles over a place when people realize the power dynamic has shifted. The HOA board, once so loud and commanding, moved with stiff, tight expressions. The president in particular seemed shaken, her usual confident stride replaced with sharp, hurried steps. She avoided eye contact with everyone, as if worried that even a simple glance might reveal her crumbling authority. But beneath her panic was something more dangerous, a determination to regain control at any cost. The homeowner sensed that the fight wasn't over. The HOA wasn't just embarrassed, they were humiliated, and humiliation has a way of turning small leaders into desperate tyrants. The binder he had presented wasn't just evidence, it was a direct challenge to their authority, and the president couldn't tolerate being undermined. She had built her role on fear and compliance, and losing that meant losing everything she believed she controlled. Over the next couple of days, strange things began happening. His mailbox suddenly received duplicate letters from the HOA, each with new accusations, minor lawn violations, obscure maintenance rules, claims that his trash bins were misaligned by 3 inches. The letters were petty, inconsistent, and obviously retaliatory. They were meant to bury him in paperwork, hoping he would crumble under the pressure. But each time he opened one, he simply added it to a growing folder labeled retaliation attempts. He documented everything. The dates, the tone, the contradictions, all of it. He knew exactly what they were doing, and he was preparing for their next move before they even made it. Across the neighborhood, whispers started. Neighbors were beginning to notice the HOA's sudden fixation on him. Some quietly supported him, secretly cheering for someone to finally stand up to the board. Others worried about the president's increasingly unhinged behavior. One of the longtime residents, who had lived there even before the HOA existed, mentioned that every few years a board member tried something outrageous, but never anything this bold. The tension reached a breaking point when, late one afternoon, a group of board members walked to his property with clipboards in hand. They didn't knock. They didn't call. They simply walked the perimeter of his driveway, measuring things, pointing at the ground, taking photographs. It was an intimidation tactic, designed to show him that they were still in control, that they could invade his space whenever they wished. But this time, he was ready. From inside his home, he recorded the entire scene through the window. He let them continue their little performance, knowing every second of footage strengthened his case. He didn't confront them, he didn't need to. Their actions were building a trail of harassment so undeniable that even the most HOA-friendly attorney wouldn't defend it. That evening, he compiled everything into a digital folder. Every letter, every photograph, every minute of video. And then he filed a formal report with the county, attaching the retaliation evidence. He didn't announce this to the HOA. He wanted them to keep digging deeper. The further they went, the worse it would get for them. The board's desperation escalated when the president called an emergency HOA meeting, one she didn't invite him to. But word travels fast in suburban communities, especially when tensions are high. A neighbor who lived 2 houses down, someone who had quietly watched the drama unfold, overheard the board's heated conversation through open windows. They were planning something big. They wanted to redefine boundaries. They wanted to reinterpret community access. And worst of all, they wanted to propose a special vote that would allow the HOA to claim shared use areas, including, absurdly, his privately owned driveway, without compensating homeowners. It was a plan rooted in panic, one that ignored both law and logic. And the homeowners weren't buying it. For many of them, the driveway issue had opened their eyes. If the HOA could target him today, they could target anyone tomorrow. The board didn't realize it, but their power was slipping. 3 days later, the situation exploded. A letter arrived at his door stamped final notice. It demanded immediate payment of the $50,000 driveway assessment. The HOA doubled down, ignoring all evidence, declaring that his obstruction of community property was a violation subject to escalating penalties. It was outrageous, reckless, and clearly illegal. But this was the moment he had been waiting for. With calm precision, he drafted a response. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was a cold, detailed summary of every piece of evidence he had collected, complete with references to county statutes, property rights laws, and documented HOA overreach. At the bottom of the letter, he included a simple line. This matter has now been forwarded to the county property commissioner, the district attorney's office, and my legal counsel. Then he attached the full binder as a digital copy and sent it directly to every board member. What happened next was something no one in the neighborhood expected. At sunrise the following morning, 2 county officials and a property commissioner arrived at the HOA office. They didn't knock politely, they walked in with authority, carrying clipboards, legal folders, and a mandate to investigate serious misconduct. Residents peeked through blinds and stood on porches, whispering as word spread across the entire community. The HOA president came outside, pale and trembling, trying to maintain composure. But the officials weren't there for discussion, they were there for answers. They requested documentation, meeting minutes, maps, and justification for every accusation and fee the HOA had issued. Within minutes, it became clear the HOA had nothing. No maps. No historical records. No proof. No legal authority. Everything they claimed was rooted in assumption, ego, and intimidation. The officials didn't hide their disappointment. And for the first time, the HOA board, once so loud and bold, sat quietly, forced to confront the reality of their own misconduct. But the investigation wasn't the end. There was still one final revelation coming, something more dramatic than anything that had happened yet. Because the county officials discovered a document in the HOA's files that no one expected, one that proved the board had knowingly lied about the driveway for years. And once that document surfaced, the HOA's entire world began collapsing. What the officials found would not just clear his name, it would end the HOA president's reign permanently. The morning of the final reckoning arrived quietly, almost deceptively. While the neighborhood hummed with its usual routines, mailboxes rattling, sprinklers ticking, cars leaving for work, the air felt charged with anticipation. Everyone who had followed the saga of the $50,000 driveway bill knew that today would mark the end of a months-long nightmare. The homeowner, calm and composed, carried a binder thick with decades of evidence. But what he held wasn't just a collection of papers. It was a weapon of truth, precision, and undeniable proof that the HOA had overstepped every boundary it thought it controlled. By mid-morning, the community center was packed. Residents who had previously avoided HOA meetings now crowded the room, leaning forward on folding chairs, whispering, exchanging glances that carried both excitement and disbelief. For many, this wasn't just about a driveway, it was about standing up against years of petty fines, intimidation, and unchecked authority. Even neighbors who had initially sided with the board watched with unease as the homeowner arrived, binder in hand, exuding quiet confidence. The HOA president appeared shortly after, her expression a mixture of forced control and genuine fear. Gone was the arrogance that had dominated previous encounters. It had been replaced by a tense rigidity. Her assistants shuffled papers nervously, glancing at each other as if expecting some unseen disaster to unfold. The board members' whispers filled the room, trying to construct arguments from thin air, but the tension betrayed their desperation. They knew this time, they weren't facing a single homeowner, they were facing a fortress of evidence, legal precedents, and community scrutiny. The homeowner began methodically presenting his case. He started with the earliest documents, property deeds, the original developer's contracts, city surveys, and archived correspondence showing clear, uncontested ownership of the driveway. He laid each document out, allowing the residents and officials present to see the timeline of decades-long legality. Page by page, the narrative built itself, illustrating not only the absurdity of the HOA's claim but also the audacity of trying to assert power over something so obviously private. The room leaned in. Whispers turned into audible gasps as the homeowner revealed the county survey conducted during the previous week. Its findings were irrefutable. Every measurement, every boundary, and every square foot confirmed his ownership. The HOA president's attempts to interject were met with polite but firm objections by the homeowner, who maintained a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the board's growing panic. Then came the piece de resistance, the hidden document from the HOA files showing that board members had knowingly fabricated claims and threatened fines without proper authority. It was a smoking gun, a piece of evidence so damning that even the president's most loyal supporters in the room recoiled. Murmurs rippled across the audience, and some residents openly laughed at the absurdity of the board's audacity. The county officials stepped forward to review the evidence firsthand. Their faces grew serious as they examined each document, their pens scribbling notes, their eyes scanning maps and signatures. It was clear they had never encountered a case so blatantly in favor of a homeowner and so publicly undermining an HOA board. One official nodded subtly at the homeowner, a gesture that went unnoticed by most but spoke volumes. The scales of authority had shifted irreversibly. The HOA president attempted one final tactic. She raised her voice, insisting that the driveway was part of a community easement, and claimed the homeowner had been using it at the board's discretion. But her words fell flat. The evidence she tried to contradict had already been reviewed, verified, and catalogued. Residents began openly questioning her, demanding proof of her claims, and even longtime supporters of the board found themselves nodding along with the homeowner. Her confidence crumbled in real time, replaced by desperation and then by silence. As the meeting drew toward its climax, the homeowner summarized his position. The driveway had been his for over 3 decades, all HOA claims were invalid, and any attempt to collect the $50,000 fine was unlawful. He requested that the board formally retract their claims, issue a written apology, and agree to cease all retaliatory measures immediately. The room remained silent for a moment, heavy with tension, before the county officials spoke. They addressed the HOA directly, outlining the violations in documentation, intimidation tactics, and the misuse of authority. They emphasized that continued harassment of the homeowner could result in legal action, fines against the board members personally, and even potential removal from the HOA. The weight of the officials' presence, combined with the overwhelming evidence, forced the board to concede. The president's head bowed, her hands clasped nervously on the table, as she reluctantly agreed to retract the fine and acknowledge the homeowner's full ownership. Residents erupted into quiet applause. Whispers of "finally," "about time," and "he showed them" spread through the room. Some even congratulated the homeowner personally, shaking his hand or patting him on the back. The mood was celebratory yet reflective. The entire community had witnessed the collapse of unchecked authority, the victory of preparation, and the power of truth against intimidation. Outside, neighbors lingered on porches and lawns, talking animatedly about the events of the day. Cameras and phones captured moments of laughter, hugs, and disbelief. The HOA president, humiliated but not yet fully grasping the consequences, quietly left the building, flanked by 2 silent board members. Their authority had evaporated, replaced by embarrassment and fear of further scrutiny. Back inside, the homeowner packed up his binder, now a symbol of victory. The documents that had once been forgotten in an attic now stood as a testament to diligence, preparation, and courage. It wasn't just about a driveway anymore. It was about standing up, gathering proof, and showing an entire neighborhood that no authority, no matter how loud or intimidating, is above the law. By evening, word of the victory had spread throughout the community. Local residents who had been previously afraid to confront the HOA now spoke openly about prior incidents. They began organizing informal meetings to review the HOA's actions historically, demanding transparency and accountability moving forward. What started as a personal fight for a driveway had become a catalyst for change across the neighborhood. The homeowner, finally back in the quiet of his house, reflected on the months of chaos, the letters, the threats, the meetings, and the public scrutiny. He realized that the fight had been about more than property. It had been about respect, justice, and standing up to power. The HOA's arrogance had underestimated one prepared and determined individual, and that miscalculation had led to their undoing. And as night fell over the neighborhood, the once dominant HOA had been reduced to whispers behind closed doors, its authority shaken, and its members forced to face the consequences of their actions. The homeowner stepped outside, looked down his driveway, and for the first time in months, felt an unburdened sense of relief. The driveway, the land, and the principle had all been preserved. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a community lesson. When authority overreaches, the prepared, diligent, and courageous will always have the power to turn the tide. And for those who watched, it became a story they would tell for years. The story of the $50,000 driveway that no HOA could ever claim. The HOA had fallen. The homeowner had won. Justice, backed by truth and evidence, had prevailed.